we're discussing Battle of Algiers, the film. So this is a 1966 war film, kind of like a documentary or docudrama, uh, directed by Gillo Pontecorvo. And this is a film that deals with the Algerian War of Independence from the French. All right, it spanned 1954 to 1962. Now, this specifically looks at the eponymous Battle of Algiers. It's an urban guerrilla warfare between the Algerian National Liberation Front, called FLN, and the French forces, both police and military. Now, obviously, the moment you hear this, you're just like, oh, wait, Italian director. And how accurate would a film on the Algerian War of Independence be if it was made by an Italian director? But the thing is, what's really interesting about this, and there's a really good backstory to it, is that the screenplay was based on a book on the Algerian War of Independence written by Sadi Youssef in 1962. Incidentally, he plays the role of Jafar in the movie. The Algerian government, through an FLN leader, Salah Bassi, approached Pontecorvo and his screenwriter Franco Salinas to adapt the book into a film. They agreed to this request, but they also said that, they asked if they could make modifications to the narrative to sort of balance it out, because inevitably the story is going to be from the Algerian perspective. So there should also be the alternate side to give it a truly neutral, balanced framework. And the Algerian government agreed to this. They also created composite figures wherever required, because in actual history, there is no this one person who stands out and is sort of responsible for everything that happens, right? So you have many characters that could be involved in a particular incident. But for a film, that's very distracting. And it's very hard for the viewer to sort of connect to the character and be like, okay, this person did this, but that person did this. That can be really distracting. So making a composite figure is a really natural way for a film to really go forward. Alright, so the character of Colonel Mathieu that we have in the film is a composite of many different French commanders and generals. So, which is why he takes sort of center stage in the second part of the film. Now, the film, since it dealt with the Algerian War of Independence and was sort of against the French colonial rule, it was officially banned in France for 1 year. But it was many years before it was actually screened in France, because there were a lot of protests. So when it finally did get screened, there was a lot of, threats of violence and things like that. So, that's inevitable, because they saw it as a problematic film. They saw it as, it's going to be biased. Though a lot of modern French viewers who've watched the film are like, it's a very neutral, balanced perspective, and it gives you a real insight into what must have what must have gone on in Algeria. Now, what makes this film so great, alright, and why it is considered one of the great films out there, is because not just about the film itself, but even the process behind the film and how the subject matter was handled. Alright, so it is an anti-colonial film, but it's one that very uncompromisingly shows us both sides of such a conflict. So that makes it naturally controversial, because anyone would be discomforted by the kind of violence that is depicted in this film, and one that is inevitable in such a narrative. Alright, it very uncompromisingly shows us both the FLN and the people, the ordinary people of Algeria, as well as the French military, paramilitary forces, and the French citizens as well living there. Because the idea is that there's nothing like anyone can particularly claim to be neutral or innocent in this entire equation. That's the most brilliant part about the film. Now, it is also incredibly accurate in its portrayal of urban guerrilla warfare and its representation of French paramilitary forces, because the French actually had like a book on their paramilitary techniques, and it was a really prominent text for military schools. So much so that even in recent times, when the US were supposed to be, sending their troops to Iraq, and they would, in that sense, have to deal with a similar kind of a scenario of urban guerrilla warfare. The Pentagon had actually screened Battle of Algiers for the soldiers so that they would be prepared to deal with what might happen while they are stationed in occupied Iraq. So it is very accurate. I mean, to a point where a lot of the screenings of the films actually carried, what do you call a disclaimer to say that there is no actual footage being used. It's all filmed. It's all reconstructed by Pontecorvo, but that's how realistically it was shot. Now, before we can get into the movie, because we need to really start discussing that, but let us actually talk about the waves of cinema, waves of European cinema, because the stylistics of two of these waves influence this film. Alright, now the three waves that were there are German Expressionism, Italian Neorealism, and French New Wave. Each one has an interesting story of how it developed and its aesthetic style, but our concern is with the last two. Alright, so Italian Neorealism. Now, Italian Neorealism emerged when filmmakers grew disillusioned by the fascist leader Mussolini's influence on Italy and its art. So there was a realization that cinema was no more reflective of the people's experiences, and so these new filmmakers felt that they had to address the socio-political problems in Italy. The bombing of the Cinecittà studios, which was a really prominent studio in Italy, led the directors to working outdoors with minimal equipment on location with non-professional actors. And so these films that they came up with, which formed the Italian Neorealism, aimed to portray abject realism, the hard lives of the working class. And so they marked a huge shift from what cinema was up till that point of time. Pontecorvo himself was inspired by Roberto Rossellini's newsreel style of filmmaking. Now, he was a prominent filmmaker of the Italian Neorealism, and his newsreel style of filmmaking is also considered a feature of Italian Neorealism. So, which is why even when you watch the film, it feels like it's been shot by a journalist using a telephoto lens, as though, oh my God, if I get too close, it's dangerous, something could happen to me. So, it's shot in that fashion. And that's also why those disclaimers were there in the film. So, and Pontecorvo also shot on location, and he used non-professional actors, many of whom actually lived through the Algerian War of Independence, and some were former members of the FLN. In fact, Jean Martin, who played Colonel Mathieu, was the only professional actor on the cast. But interestingly, he had actual military experience, and in many of the battles that are associated with Colonel Mathieu. So it's an interesting bit of realism that just shot through in the entire film. Now, French New Wave, on the other hand, emerged because filmmakers in France felt that modern cinema lacked sincerity. So they wished to create cinema that was improvisational. They used jump cuts, handheld cameras, long takes, direct sound and light. They believed in improvised dialogues, and they reduced the dependence on the plot. So we see the French New Wave editing techniques, as well as the use of close-ups, something that wouldn't actually feature in an actual newsreel footage. Even the use of handheld cameras to give it this shaky and real kind of feel that sort of further cements his documentary style. Alright. Now, the film score is absolutely remarkable. It has one of the most stunning film scores, and this score has been designed by Ennio Morricone, who, this is a total aside, but if you are familiar with the Dollars trilogy, a spaghetti western as they were called by Sergio Leone, Morricone is the one who designed the very signature western tune, which you see featured everywhere. Like, it's been parodied, it has been represented, even Cholet uses it. So you have that really signature style. That's Ennio Morricone. All right, and the music of the film is actually like a whole narrative, a whole story in itself, because it tells us what to expect when the scene opens. So he alternates the music based on who is being featured. Alright, so such as using military drums and a clearly European style military march for the French forces, and indigenous Algerian drumming for the affluent forces. We hear the sound of military marches, gunfire, vehicular movement to depict the French forces. In turn, we hear bomb blasts, chanting, wailing, ululations when depicting the Algerian resistance. So, like a clear musical division. Alright, now into the film. So the film begins in medias res, that is, in the middle of things, which is possibly one of the most popular dramatic techniques that are out there. Alright, so it's 1957, it's a military room, we see the aftermath of a torture. There's a man at the center of it. He's shaking from his experiences, covered in bruises, really disturbing. Okay, they dress him in French military uniform. And when he sort of comes to himself, like, the fog sort of clears from his head, and he kind of realizes what's happening and what he's actually done, because he seems to have admitted to something, he screams no, and he tries to sort of run, and the soldiers, like, drag him back, slap him, and get him dressed. And the next scene we see is a title card, and we see soldiers swarming out of trucks, rushing into an urban space to flush out this rebel, terrorist, whatever, and people are being cleared out of houses. Now, it's a really dramatic sequence. So, opening shots of a film do tell us a lot about what a film is trying to sort of convey or confuse us about. In this case, the opening shots very clearly tell us this is going to be a brutal movie. This is going to be, gloves off, really hard, very gritty, and it's going to be about belief, it's going to be about conviction, and it is going to include the military, which means it's going to be about a system that has been framed or trained to sort of produce results irrespective of methods. So it's kind of ends justify the means. And we realize from the opening that it is also about colonial occupation, because it's very clear that the two parties are different racially and culturally, right? And the camera work takes this very neutral step back. It's kind of like, I'm not going to comment, I'm just going to show you what is here. So it takes that neutral stance back to give us these different perspectives and let us sort of come to our understanding of what, is really occurring. Now, right in the beginning, all right, so you have the French military confront the terrorists according to them, all right, and independence revolutionaries according to the Algerians. So we need to understand that, because the terminology is used multiple times even in the film as well, and it's a very accurate thing, because any colonial power would always frame the colonized resistance as an act of violence, as an act of terrorism against them. But actually, from their perspective, they're just fighting for their independence. All right, so it is that perspective that comes true for us. Now, we see the soldiers standing behind a false wall. It's very clear it's a false wall, and they figured it out. And there are people clearly hiding behind it. And then we show these 4 people in this wall recess. All right. And later, of course, we know who their names are, but I'm going to tell you anyways now. One is Ali Lapointe. The other is Mahmoud. then there's Hasiba, and there is this young boy called Omar. Now, they call out Ali Lapointe. He's clearly an important figure, and we kind of realize later that he's one of the 4 FLN commanders. And so they ask him to surrender, and they're like, you know what, at least let the other people exit, you know, and let them be saved, you know. And so they call out. So I'm just going to read out that. Listen good, you're the last one. It's all over. The organization's finished. Everyone's dead or in prison. If you come out now, you'll get a fair trial. Make up your mind. And so then we see the camera focus on Ali Lapointe, and it fades out. When the camera fades in again, it's Algiers 1954. So we're getting a backstory to how we end up in that moment, how we end up in that tense situation in 1957. And so the film, what we realize, has this very episodic quality, all right? And it deals with important incidents of the resistance movement in Algiers. So which is why you have timestamps and date stamps that constantly come up before each incident is sort of shown to us, all right? And the camera work is stunning because it reveals these really subtle aspects of colonial occupation and violence. Like, for instance, right when we're shown the timestamp of Algiers 1954, we're shown the European quarters of Algiers. And it's beautiful. It's got boulevards and wide spaces. And then it's contrasted with Kasbah. All right, Kasbah is the Algerian quarters of Algiers. And it's cramped, piled up. You have buildings on buildings. And everything is really sort of claustrophobically sort of stacked together. And that itself tells you access to space and tells you something about the kind of inherent violence that exists. Like, it goes beyond the actual physical acts of violence, but also from the sense that they are denied access to property in their own land. That is the violence of colonialism, right? And so we get this sense that, okay, we're walking into this, it's going to be an intense film, right? And so this section opens with like a voiceover, and we hear the communique number 1 from the National Liberation Front, the FLN. If you're wondering why it sounds different, that's because FLN is basically the abbreviation coming from the French term for it, right? And it translates into National Liberation Front. So the voiceover is, people of Algeria, our combat is directed against communalism. Our aim, independence and restoration of the Algerian state, in accordance with Islamic principles and the respect of basic liberties, regardless of race and religion. To avoid bloodshed, we propose that the French authorities negotiate with us our right to self-determination. Algerians, it is your duty to save your country and restore its liberty. Its victory will be yours. Onward, brothers, unite. The LN calls you to arms. Now, this voiceover is barely done when we see Ali Lapointe, okay? And he's running a card game. So we're getting what he was before he became this really important figure in the FLN, all right? And before he ended up in that hidden wall recess in 1957. So he's speaking in Arabic, then switching to French, because you realize that, you know, there's also a linguistic gap between these two spaces. So he notices the cops, so he runs, and as he's running away, he nears these groups of, you know, French, young Frenchmen. And one of them just trips him as a prank because he seemed to be in a hurry. So you automatically see that there is this sense that, you know, there's no general concern for another being, another person. There's none of that. It's just like, yeah, you are not my kind of people, so I don't need to show you any respect. And because he just got tripped and he's running from the cops, he's so angry, very understandably so. So he just punches this man, and then the others gang up like, oh my god, how could you do this? And yeah, finally it's the cops who manage to extricate him from this mob, and they, you know, take him away. And as he's being sort of taken away, the voiceover is that of, like, it sounds like that of a judge reading out his rap sheet and his sentence, like what kind of punishment he's going to receive. And he cuts a really abject figure at that point. Like you feel terrible because you realize that sense of hopelessness that comes through. And even when you're listening to his rap sheet, so it's of course a series of crimes, but you realize that it's coming from this pent up anger, because a lot of them are kind of, it's kind of like acting out against circumstances. And so it is a reflection of despair. It is a reflection of colonial violence. People don't just take to this just like that. I mean, it happens from certain restrictions that are forcibly imposed on you. All right? And that's terrible. Now, it cuts immediately. So that's the other thing. The scenes cut into the next. It's like, this is over. Now the next episode, next important incident. So this is in a prison, and we show this Algerian man being taken away for execution. And since he's calling out slogans, we can tell that he's a revolutionary. Now, Ali Lapointe watches him being guillotined. Alright, being taken away to the guillotine. And the scene immediately cuts, just before the guillotine is shown. It cuts to 5 minutes later, and we're shown, this is a really interesting scene because we're shown rainwater streaming down a ledge, and it's a ledge with a very serrated kind of a design, sort of mirroring the guillotine itself. And so it's kind of disturbing because, yeah, that is literally the violence of such an incident. Now, we're shown Kasbah, and it's abject poverty, all right? And it's terrible because we see the denial, because especially since we've already been shown the European quarters, when we see Kasbah, we see the kind of actual poverty that exists over there. It's terrible. So we're also introduced to Omar at this point. So again, we're basically shown all the main players and how they really come by. Now, so this boy, approaches Ali with a message from the Ellen, and it's a test to see, if he truly wants to fight for the organization or if he's just, a spy or something. So when Ali meets Jafar, he explains the whole thing to him, and this scene happens at a balcony, which is, by the way, a recurrent scene because there's a later scene in the film where again Ali is in conversation with another important figure from the FLN, and it happens at night on a balcony. All right, so Jafar says, first we need to get organized and secure our hideouts, then we can take action. The organization is getting stronger, but there are still too many drunks, whores, junkies, people who talk too much, people ready to sell us out. We must win them over or eliminate them. We need to clean house first, organize the country. Only then we can take on our real enemy. You understand, Ali? Now, that's a really intense statement, and which is why the next scene immediately cuts to the communique number 24. So there's been a lot of them. And it's basically, they're telling that we have decided to fight against the French government's attempt to lead people towards addiction of drugs, alcohol, sex. And during this voiceover, we see regular people harass this drunk, target this drunk. So we finally see him surrounded by young children. All right, like a mob harassing him. And they're like drag him down the stairs. It's a very disturbing scene. All right, it's kind of like that Game of Thrones moment of the little birds, and it's very uncomfortable to see children behave with such violence, but children basically ape what we show them. So this is what they're seeing around them, and that's what they have normalized. Also, we can also see how powerful or influential the FLN has become, because they have said this is what we want to do, and people are like, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to eliminate all of this. Now, it might seem strange, the decision to fight against addiction, but actually addiction has frequently been used by colonial powers to restrain the colonized. It's not new. It has been done in many places. Where drugs were forcibly introduced into countries, into communities, just to destroy them, destroy resistance. So it's not actually a new concept, and in that sense, They may be entirely accurate, but that doesn't mean that their attempts to fix it is always going to be a healthy choice, right? Because that scene of the drunk being dragged is really terrible, really violent, and it's one of the many mob violence sequences that we see, right? Now, and actually, the other thing is that we realize where the argument is coming from, but you also realize that in a bid to fix the situation, there's no guarantee that either of the sides, the FLN or the military, the French military, are necessarily going to take moral or ethical decisions every time. They're just going to ends justify the means. Alright, now the next scene we are shown is June 10, 1956. We're shown an Algerian wedding being conducted in secret, and it clearly implies, and even the dialogue sort of highlight the fact that there are some restrictions imposed by the French government about Algerian celebrations, so that's why they have to conduct it in secret. And clearly this has to do with someone from the FLN, because even the person conducting the wedding is carrying a gun and carrying certain kind of documents, so clearly it's organized by them. And we see that the person who is getting married is Mahmoud, one of the people in the War says. So again, backstory. All right, so we see this wedding being conducted all secretly, and we see people looking at the wedding from balconies and rooftops. This is again a recurring thing, because they have those inner courtyards, and those inner courtyards are open to the sky, so people from other balconies and rooftops can kind of look in and sort of participate in it, even though they are otherwise not permitted to sort of gather. It may actually be a restriction against people gathering, because that's another thing that a lot of colonial rulers have done, put limits on how many people can gather in a place. So after this, we are the next important incident is June 20th, 1956, and there's a series of murders of police officers by Algerians, and in each case they take their guns away. There's pushback by the French government, who basically are like, oh, anyone comes for treatment for a gunshot wound, you have to inform us. So the hospitals are basically prevented from giving treatment. And we see barricades being put up in the Arab quarters, and the Algerians are made to do it. The French police are just basically directing them, and that's realistic too, because a lot of time in colonized spaces, the colonized are being punished, but they're the ones putting together the frameworks for their punishment, because they're still the majority. Yeah. Now, most of these murders of cops and important people happen in daylight, and the people don't carry the guns themselves, right? So the thing is that it's stored away in these really noxious kind of places like dustbins and garbage dumps or vegetable baskets, and so it's harder for people to detect, and you kind of realize that the entire community is working together to ensure this, because there is basically resentment, and that resentment is sort of coming out in this really violent fashion. Now, this leads us to this pretty disturbing incident. It's really uncomfortable. 33 minutes into the film, there is this scene of this old Algerian man. He's sitting on the street to eat his lunch, and you can see his work equipment near him. He's in the European quarters. And all of a sudden, many of the Europeans, they come out onto the balconies and they start screaming. They basically judged him as this really suspicious figure, and they're screaming, and it's a really vicious kind of a scene. And things like, murder all the bastards, then we'll have some peace, there he is, I'm sure it's him, where, down there, get him, murderer, he looks like a dirty falaga. And you can see his distress, because he's just what's happening? He drops his stuff, he forgets his equipment there, and he just tries to walk away because he's so anxious, like, what's happening? Why are they targeting me? And the problem is that you are reacting to the fear that's being directed at you, the rage that's being directed at you, making you come across as suspicious, which again makes you an object of suspicion. So it's like a cycle that you can't sort of escape from. And so they're still screaming at him, like, filthy Arab, don't let him get away, and he's getting away, stop him, stop him. And so the cops have heard it, and so they come and then they take this man into custody. And you have the cops discussing his details. But the fact is, he has been booked, he has been taken into custody. And you realize that this is one of many such people who may have been dragged into custody for no fault of theirs, only because they came across as suspicious to the Europeans in the European quarter. And that's enough for them to be sort of targeted and marred as criminals. And so it's a really uncomfortable scenario, because what it also reminds us that this is the other side of the colonial violence, because a lot of it is based on prejudice. And so that prejudice is going to act out in these really distressing fashions. And it's disturbing. Now, we've been seeing the cops who've been sort of investigating these murders, and they're getting frustrated at not being able to fix the situation. And so we see them one night after a dinner party heading somewhere in a car, and we're kind of wondering where they're going because it seems kind of suspicious. And then we realize that they're in Kasbah, and they've left a bomb in front of a house. It's a residential area. And they leave, and it blows up, and the thing is catastrophic. It's a terrible thing. We can hear mourning, we can hear solemn music, there's debris being cleared, people are crying, wailing. It's a really heartbreaking scene of carnage, lots of bodies being removed. And that anger at someone targeting, an innocent location results in the next scene being a protest led by Ali Lapointe. But Omar tries to stop him because the LN have a different plan. And so we see their plan, which is it's the infamous milk bar bombing incident. So 3 beautiful Algerian women, they take off their burqas, they dress themselves as Europeans. One of them happens to be Hasiba. So backstory again. And they make it, out of the checkpoints without issue because, they don't look like locals. And we're seeing how just looking more Algerian, not being able to communicate in French, gets you targeted. It's kind of like racial profiling, basically. And so these women make it out because they look so European. One of them manages to flirt with the soldier. So, yeah. And they collect the bombs from Jafar, and then they drop it at these prominent milk bars. All right. And the camera work is really interesting. In fact, this scene is brilliant because on one hand, you feel the tension of these women. You want them to get out of there safe, not get caught, because that's going to be terrible for them. But at the same time, the camera work is also showing you the faces of these ordinary Europeans just sitting around in these milk bars, talking to people, having fun. It's like it's like a cafe. And so you're also like, oh my god, this shouldn't happen, this is going to be really terrible. And the bombs blow up. And the music, so before the bombs, it's all this peppy really music, or it's this very tense kind of march because these women are making it to these places. But the moment the bombs burst, it switches to this really formal, solemn, funeral kind of music. And remember, the whole point of the film is also to show us a contrast. So in the previous bombing and the Kasbah, you have locals coming together, clearing out the debris, removing out the bodies, and there's just, you just have people, it's just the local Algerian population there, absolutely distressed in that scenario. But here, because this is in the European quarter, and these are Europeans who were murdered, ambulances come in, fire trucks show up, everything shows up. There's so much of government support to fix this situation. So again, we are given that contrast between how they're treated. When you are constantly being seen as a second-class citizen in your own land, that is bound to make you enraged. And because this bombing has happened, the very next scene we're shown, 10 Jan 1957, the arrival of paratroopers and Colonel Matthews. So the implication is really clear. The police cannot fix the situation, the military has to come in. All right, we need tough decisions, tough acts to sort of suppress these rebels. And so soon after his grand entry with the soldiers and everything, you have him sort of brief the soldiers about the FLN, and while he does it, he makes some really interesting statements. So he tells them that they need to conduct interrogations, but what he implies is very clear when he says, conducted in such a way as to ensure we always get an answer. In our situation, humane considerations can only lead to despair and confusion. What's important about this scene is that as he's saying this in this very matter-of-fact fashion, you have some of the soldiers like swallowing uncomfortably, like, oh my god, what are we going to have to do? Like, this is so disturbing. Because the fact is that even for them, and no one willingly, unless of course you are a sadist, you are not going to enjoy doing such things. It does take a toll on you. But the implication of his command is clear. Leave your humanity aside. If you start thinking compassionately, you will not get the results you require. Because the idea is that crimes committed for your country are not crimes. They're acts of patriotism. And that's the same argument on both sides, because even for the FLN members who are making these bombs and putting them in, they're not seeing it as something bad, because they're like, hey, we have to do this. This is how we're going to get away. This is how we're going to get our independence. It's very clear on both ends. Now, at this point, you realize that Matthew knows that he needs the FLN to act up so he can be given command and control of the city, because the military can do great things if they have everything at their disposal, right? So they need to either create a situation or force the FLN to create a situation, all right? But on the other hand, at the same time, since the UN is debating on Algeria, the FLN is like, it's going to be a week-long ban, strike, no violence from anyone. We will show how seriously we want freedom, all right? And this is the point where, like, so Ali Lapointe doesn't agree with the idea of a strike. So he has this conversation at the balcony at night, as mentioned, it's a recurring scene, with Ben Mahidi, who is an important leader of the, like a top leader of the FLN. And he makes this stunning, absolutely, and it's so accurate, because he says, acts of violence don't win wars, neither wars nor revolutions. Terrorism is useful as a start, but then the people themselves must act. That's the rationale behind the strike, to mobilize all Algerians to assess our strength. Ali, it's hard enough to start a revolution, even harder to sustain it, and the hardest of all, to win it. But it's only afterwards, once we won, that the real difficulties begin. And this statement is very relevant because it's relevant with regards to how the film finally wraps up for us, as well as any freedom struggle that has occurred around the world. Because even if you say, look at the Indian independence, there is a lot of protest, there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of, civil disobedience, all of that happened. But after you are a sovereign nation, now you have to deal with what you have left and how you have to fix the scenario. So true difficulties really do begin then, and that can't be ignored. So the strike, that's the whole incident is interesting, because so the strike proceeds, but the military does everything to stop it, because they need to force the FLN to react. So they literally force people out, drag them out, get them to open their shops, take them and make them do work at like labor camps and all kinds of things. And they also spread propaganda against the FLN, saying, oh, the FLN wants to starve you and condemn you to poverty. But this is also the point where there's one of my favorite scenes in the film, where that boy Omar, so just when the French are sort of calling out this propaganda statements, and people look really dejected because, they don't know what to believe, they don't know what to trust, they don't know if they should really listen to what the French are saying, any of these things. And he just, calls out, Algerians, brothers, take heart, the FLN tells you not to be afraid. Don't worry, we're winning. And the FLN is on your side. And people are just like, okay, and they take heart, and immediately they start, screaming and shouting and ululating, long live Algeria. So it's really interesting. That entire sequence is a fascinating piece. So, but of course, the UN decides not to intervene. So the strike is technically not successful, because the UN is not too convinced if people really want freedom, and the military is thrilled, so they start distributing food, and there's a peppy marching band. It's really mean because it's like they're rubbing it in, and it's kind of like they're riding on a high, because they almost nearly end up catching the 4 main leaders of the FLN, who somehow managed to escape dressed as women. But you can really see that the noose is tightening on the FLN, right? So we're coming closer and closer to that tense moment in the opening shots. And even the fact that the FLN doesn't react, for a lot of people, that was a very accurate portrayal, because the UN does not act. It's a very accurate portrayal because a lot of times many of these organizations, they are sort of on the side of the main players, and some of them are responsible for such situation. So they're not necessarily going to always act, because they might just tacitly support their own. And so we see a lot of, there's a lot of rage because the strike didn't work, people were forced, they were put in very distressing situations. So again, there's a bomb, and this time it's at the races, and there's a lot of tumult and fear, and this is our next major mob violence incident that we've seen after the beggar. And in this case, they target this young Algerian boy who's selling snacks. All right, clearly he has nothing to do, but much of these acts of violence that have happened in public spaces have been from innoxious people. So for the French who see him, it's like, you could be responsible, we don't know. And it's literally again, just like how the cops had to rescue Ali Lapointe in the beginning from those young French boys. Similarly here, the cop had to rescue this young boy because he's getting beaten by a mob, all because they're like, you know what, you're Algerian, we don't trust you anymore. And it's really, it's hard to watch, honestly. Now there are 2 important sequences, and the conversations in this are really significant because so these are scenes with the journalists. So one is where the journalists are interviewing Ben Mahidi, who has been captured, all right, and the other is after his apparent suicide in the prison. So in the first one, they ask him a question. Mr. Ben Mahidi, isn't it cowardly to use women's baskets to carry bombs which have taken so many innocent lives? Ben Mahidi's statement is very, it really forces you to think. Isn't it even more cowardly to attack defenseless villages with napalm bombs that kill many thousands of times more? Obviously, planes would make things easier for us. Give us your bombers, sir, and you can have our baskets. And he is a very lucid speaker. He clearly is very articulate. And so Colonel Matthew immediately ends the interview because he's like, I don't want it to have the opposite effect, because the last thing the military want is for the journalists to want to support Ben Mahidi or to present him in a positive light, because that would just work against everything they've done. All right, and they wouldn't want them to sort of write about him with respect and fascination. Now the next incident is, of course, when he's apparently killed himself in prison, and so Matthew is being questioned about the torture and murder of Ben Mahdi. So he's like, see, I didn't make any of those statements, not me. And for my part, I had the chance to appreciate the moral fiber, courage, and commitment of Ben Mahdi to his own ideals, and so, notwithstanding the great danger he represented, I pay tribute to his memory. And he comments on his methods as well as turns the question on them when he says, we use interrogation as the only valid police method against clandestine activity. The FLN asks its members, in case of capture, to remain silent for 24 hours. Then they may talk. This gives the FLN time to render any information useless. And us? What form of questioning must we adopt? Honestly, when you hear his perspective, you kind of understand where the military is coming from. Because to them, the directive given to them is clear. Get results. That's it. And this is his statement that I would say is the most central to the entire film, because it throws up all the main questions that the film is really about. The problem is this: the FLN wants to throw us out of Algeria and we want to stay. Even with slight shades of opinion, you all agree that we must stay. When the FLN rebellion began, there were no shades at all. Every paper, the communist press included, wanted it crushed. We are here for that reason alone. We are neither madmen nor sadists. Those who call us fascists forget the role many of us played in the resistance. Those who call us Nazis don't know that some of us survived Dachau and Buchenwald. We are soldiers. Our duty is to win. Therefore, to be precise, it's my turn to ask a question. Should France stay in Algeria? If your answer is still yes, then you must accept all the consequences. And this is an important moment because it's central to the entire film. You have a problem with our violent methods, but you still want to be a colonial power here. Then you got to choose. You can't have this and that. You can't be like, oh, let's remain in power, but let's not be violent. How are you going to achieve that? And it's a very valid argument. And I think it's the dilemma that every military constantly faces when they're placed in a situation where they have to take decisions they're not happy with taking, but the rules are clear. Get us results. Doesn't matter how. And so they get results, because the very next scene that we see are a series of torture. And it is by far one of the hardest scenes to watch. The whole thing comes with barely any music. It's just different scenes of torture, and it's like you see the scene of torture and then close-ups of people's faces, and a lot of those torture seems to be happening in people's homes because there are onlookers watching it happen. I think also to sort of get people anxious, get them so afraid that they will start to confess in fear. And even the soldiers look really disturbed because they're constantly smoking. It's kind of like a stress response. So you have a lot of rage that's happening constantly. And you see that things are really tightening. So we already saw that they nearly caught the FLN leaders, the 4 top commanders, and we see him slowly narrowing down on each one of them. So Matthew, for instance, is at a point where he's, negotiating with Murad and another leader, and they're like, yeah, sure, we'll give up our guns, give us like a written statement, promising us safe passage. But it's all a pretense, because they pretend to give their guns, but they actually send down a bomb. And we see a soldier coming to give the signed letter of Matthew, and it focuses on his face, and we feel like, oh my god, this is messed up, he's going to die now. And just when you're feeling sorry for him, he calls out racial slurs, and you're like, you can't feel sorry for anybody at this point. You're just like, it's like they seem to be intentionally making it horrible for each other. It's like, you can't support this violence, you can't support that violence, but you're just like, this is such an unnatural situation that's being created, and there's so much of rage. Alright, the next person being targeted is Jafar, and you see him, telling the women to burn the papers. He's hiding away at somebody's house. Matthew's like, just calm down, otherwise we're going to blow up the house. And he's like, yeah, go ahead. But it's also the sense of like, this whole thing is pointless. So finally he surrenders, and he's burnt all the papers. So, and he's sitting in the car with Matthew. And Matthew's like, yeah, I knew you wouldn't let us blow up. I've spent so much time studying you. I think I know you well enough. And the woman who's with him is just so angry because she's just like, Alila Point is still in Kasbah. You think you got us? No, there's still one more person left. You haven't got him. And finally, we're shown those 4 people. So we realize we're at that final scene. People have been evacuated. People are watching this whole thing unfold. And you have these 4 people sitting in such tension. And Hasiba is like, what do you want us to do? And Alila Point is like, you want to go? You can go. I just don't trust them. I'm not leaving. And it's a really sad moment because this is going to end really badly. Because everyone around is watching. There are people praying. They're crying. We see Mahmoud's wife crying. It's really sad. And even the soldiers are just waiting for them to surrender. And finally, we have the last 2 soldiers step out. So because clearly they're not surrendering. Mahmoud's wife is again crying. We see, the camera cut to that. We see Ali hug Omar, and the building blows up. And it's anticlimactic, because you finally have this whole conversation between the soldiers and the officers, because Gentile has also arrived, and they're like, oh, the tapeworm's dead now, headless now, which is a reference to one of Matthew's earlier briefings where he describes the FLN as a tapeworm that cannot be killed unless it's beheaded. And you have, them making these really condescending statements when, like one of the soldiers like, they're basically decent people. We got on fine for 130 years. Why shouldn't it continue? And one of them's like, but Algiers isn't all of Algeria. But true, let's settle for Algiers. And it's very condescending. It's very trite. It makes the whole thing, like everything we've seen up till now, seem pointless, unnecessary. Like, why did we waste our time? And it almost looks like, they've succeeded. But no. And just when you feel it, like you get this really like, oh my God, what is the point of all of this? It's so anticlimactic. 11 December 1960. People are stepping out. They're taking to the streets. There are protests. They're relating. And it has nothing to do with the FLN. It's entirely the people. And this seems to echo what Ben Mahidi said, that the people have to make the final decision. And there's a journalistic voiceover saying things like, this morning for the first time out came flags with crescent and star. And you have the soldiers coming in because they don't know, like, where did this come from? Everything was so quiet for a couple of years and suddenly these people are out here. And the journalists who are sort of, recording this incident are making some really problematic statements, such as when they say the Muslim quarters still echo with those unintelligible and frightening rhythmic cries, which is basically othering, which is central to colonialism, because colonialism is built on the idea that us versus them. Us is superior, them are inferior, they don't make sense, they don't have a culture, so they should be subdued by us, right? And that's the same argument, because when you're saying it's unintelligible rhythmic cries, no, it's not unintelligible. It makes a lot of sense. It's very essential to their culture, but you don't understand it. That's it. And that's something that's sort of been pointed out. And so we see a series of protests on different dates, 21st December, so many things. And people are just like, we want our independence, we want our pride. And we see women out at the front shaking the flags in the faces of the soldiers. And the last voiceover is, the Algerian nation was born. And it's a remarkably made film because a lot of the footage we see is so realistic. If you were to compare the protest scenes with actual protest scenes, you would find no difference. It's literally the spirit of a people who desperately want freedom, who've had enough, who've decided to come through, who are not rallying behind leaders, but who've decided to come together on their own and be like, enough is enough. We deserve freedom. That's what makes this film so relevant, so significant as an anti-colonial narrative. as a relevant text for any scholar who studies colonialism, because it's a text that basically delineates what does resistance really look like? What does it mean to fight for what you so desperately want? Making it definitely a very phenomenal piece of filmmaking, and a very reflective of people's despair and desire to fight for their freedom. So it remains one of those significant pieces of filmmaking, especially because of how accurately it has portrayed an independence struggle. It's maybe a film about Algeria, but it could very well be a film about any country fighting for its freedom, because in many ways it is the same system of resistance that we see, barring some differences, that plays out everywhere. And so it truly encompasses the spirit of an entire nation. So Battle of Algiers definitely deserves a hype. It is not a comfortable watch, but it is a great film, especially if we want to understand what it must have been like to be in that situation at that point of time. So please do watch, and I hope this was useful.